Okay, so this video we're going to discuss photosynthesis. It's how autotrophs can take sunlight, can take carbon dioxide, and can take a little bit of rainwater and through a very complex series of chemical reactions produce oxygen waste. But really the prize of photosynthesis is the creation of sugars such as glucose. So let's get started. So I'd like to direct your attention to the electromagnetic spectrum. It's the energy given off by the sun. And visible light really is what's going to power photosynthesis. And visible light is only a small portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. But we're going to focus on visible light given off by the sun because that's what's responsible for photosynthesis. Well, let's look briefly at how objects either absorb or reflect light. You know, the sun gives off visible light, white light. The colors of visible light are actually a mixture of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. So white light, the visible light given off by the sun, is actually a mixture of these 7 colors here. Well, how do we know this? How do we know that the visible white light is all these colors mushed together? Well, if you've ever played with a prism as a child, if you shine sunlight into one end of the prism, you can actually see a rainbow come out the other end. This animation here shows what I just mentioned. Coming in from the left, we have sunlight or white light. And because of the curvature of the glass prism, the individual wavelengths are separated. You can see that red has a wider wavelength and the violets have a more narrow wavelength, proving that sunlight or white light, visible light, is actually made up of a mixture of colors. You know, we can often see something similar to this just outside in nature. If there's moisture in the air, you know, after it's rained, or in this case, you can see moisture coming from a waterfall. But we can see that moisture in the air kind of acts like a prism and will separate sunlight into the individual wavelengths, producing a rainbow. So when we come back to how light is absorbed or reflected, well, first of all, when sunlight shines on this green leaf here, again, sunlight is a mixture of all these colors. The reason that we see green in our eyes is because green light is reflecting off of the leaf. The other colors are absorbing. We see the world as reflected light. If you see somebody wearing an orange shirt, orange is reflecting off of that shirt. The other colors are absorbing into the shirt. So if we were to shine sunlight onto these bananas, which color or colors would reflect into the person's eyes? Which color or colors would be absorbed? Well, if the bananas appear yellow, that's because yellow is reflecting into your eyes. The other colors are absorbing into the banana. Well, in this case, again, we have some balloons now. Which color or colors would reflect and which would absorb? If the balloons appear blue, that's because blue light is reflecting into the person's eyes. All the other colors are absorbing. Well, here's a fun one right here. Here we have sunlight shining on some snow and some trees covered in snow. But if you think, why do the trees appear white? Why does snow appear white? Because white reflects. So all the colors are reflecting, and therefore our brain is interpreting all of this incoming light as the color white. In this case, none of the colors are absorbing. And so kind of the opposite of white is black. If light is shining on this automobile, the color black reflects nothing. The color black absorbs all. So when you see a black object, whether it's a shirt or an automobile, you're really seeing no light at all. No light is entering your eyes, and we interpret that as the color black. So how does light reflection and absorption relate to photosynthesis? Well, most plants have green leaves, which means they're going to reflect green light. The other colors, however, are going to absorb, and those are the colors that really drive photosynthesis. This graph right here shows the wavelengths of visible light, and there's 2 points on the graph where the line is the highest. This implies the colors or the wavelengths that drive photosynthesis. So around 400 nanometers we see a peak in the graph, and that corresponds to the color blue. Around 700 nanometers there's another peak, and that corresponds to the color red. Ironically, the color that we most associate with plants, the color green, has some of the smallest or lowest rates of photosynthesis. So green light is very poor in production of sugars. However, blue light and red lights drive photosynthesis. So let's actually get into photosynthesis now. It's the cellular process where sunlight is converted into sugars. And you've probably seen this equation ever since middle school. To the left of the arrow, we have what are called the reactants. Carbon dioxide and water are the reactants, or the ingredients required to perform photosynthesis. In the presence of sunlight, carbon dioxide and water will produce sugar and oxygen. To the right of an arrow are what we call the products. It's what's the end result, what's created. And this equation really makes photosynthesis look pretty simple. But when we get into the details, we're going to see it's very complex. Well, so who performs photosynthesis? Well, we often mistakenly only think that plants are the only photosynthetic organisms on Earth, and that's just not true. Autotrophs perform photosynthesis, and plants are just one type of autotroph. In the top right-hand corner, there's a picture of kelp, which is in the kingdom Protista. In the bottom left are cyanobacteria, which are bacteria. The bottom middle, those are plankton. Plankton are also a type of Protista. And in the bottom right, we have algae. Algae is also in kingdom Protista. So there's a lot of autotrophs that perform photosynthesis besides plants. So what kind of chemical reaction is photosynthesis? It's what we call an endergonic chemical reaction because it requires an input of energy. Now the picture should imply where the input of energy comes from. Sunlight. Sunlight is the energy that is inputted into photosynthesis in order to start a complex series of chemical reactions known as photosynthesis. So the end result, or the products of photosynthesis, again, are sugar and oxygen waste. In this leaf, if we zoom on in, we see these microscopic pores called stomata on leaves. And when the stomata open and close, they can release oxygen into the environment. They can take in carbon dioxide from the environment. So the stomata are how plants can exchange gas with their environment. So let's look at a quick overview of the chloroplast, or the site of photosynthesis. We can break photosynthesis really into 2 processes. The first being called the light-dependent reactions. Well, if I chop open a chloroplast, I can show you that there's these structures on the inside, and I've circled a structure called a granum. Notice how the circled structure labeled the granum is actually made up of 3 individual units called thylakoids. Well, this is where the light-dependent reactions occur. This is where the photosystems, which are groups of molecules to capture and transfer energy, so this is where the photosystems ultimately are going to help to create oxygen, ATP, and a molecule called NADPH. The other stage or process that takes place during photosynthesis is called the light-independent reactions. This really occurs in the fluid-filled interior called the stroma, and this is going to be the location where glucose is created. Well, let's go ahead and jump into it. So here's a picture of our chloroplast again. And if we look at a much simpler version of a chloroplast, here's a granum made up of 3 thylakoids. Well, let's zoom on into one thylakoid. So now that we're inside looking at a thylakoid, we're ready to start the light-dependent reactions. If you're in my biology class, I've broken this animation down according to the diagram in our textbook. So follow along at step 1 in our textbook. So what happens is, notice how in the membrane of the thylakoid there's an object labeled PS1 and PS2. These are what are called the photosystems. So first of all, there's chlorophyll in the photosystems. Photosystem 2 is going to absorb sunlight. And the chlorophyll that's inside of photosystem 2 has electrons. And those electrons become excited. And what that means is that the electrons jump into the actual thylakoid membrane. This causes the thylakoid membrane to become negatively charged. If you remember, electrons have a negative charge to them. Well, once the thylakoid membrane becomes negatively charged, this is going to start what we call an electron transport chain. It's a chain reaction of a series of events triggered by all these electrons. So now look at area 2 and area 3 in your book diagram, and what we're going to show you is that water molecules are going to be broken. At the top of the animation there are 3 molecules of H2O, water. And what I'm going to show you is that hydrogen from the water is going to be pulled into the thylakoids. There are enzymes, I didn't picture the enzymes in this animation, but there are enzymes that will break apart the water and allow the hydrogen to be pulled into the thylakoids. Now there's a reason, of course, that this is all happening. The photosystem 2 just lost a bunch of electrons. In order to keep this process going, photosystem 2 needs to have its electrons replenished. So the electrons of those hydrogens are going to go into photosystem 2 to replenish the electrons that it previously lost. Ultimately, notice what's been created at the top. Oxygen waste. And so the oxygen will be released through the stomata of the plant and into the environment. And I think that's kind of cool that oxygen that we breathe used to be part of water molecules. So moving on into the next area of the light-dependent reactions, I want you to focus your attention on PS1, photosystem 1. In case you're wondering, the reason it's called photosystem 1, even though we're talking about it second, is I think photosystem 1 was just simply discovered first. So photosystem number 1, just like photosystem number 2, are groups of molecules, and it contains chlorophyll. There's chlorophyll in photosystem number 1, and when sunlight strikes photosystem 1, the electrons of chlorophyll become excited, and just like we saw a moment ago, the electrons enter into the membrane of the thylakoid membrane. And this is going to continue our electron transport chain, the chain reaction of events that takes place because of all these electrons. So moving on to the next step of the light-dependent reactions. The electrons that are embedded in the thylakoid membrane, along with various enzymes, are going to help bond a couple items together. There's a molecule with the full name of nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate. We're just going to call this molecule NADP. So the molecule NADP and a hydrogen ion are going to be drawn together by the electrons in the thylakoid membrane and various enzymes. And when they're drawn together, the NADP and the hydrogen are going to bond together to make a molecule called NADPH. Now the notes say NADPH is a hydrogen taxi. You know, a taxi is designed to pick a person up at one location and drop them off at another. NADPH is called a hydrogen carrier, a hydrogen taxi. It's going to pick up a hydrogen and it's going to take the hydrogen to another location where it will ultimately play a role. So when we go on to the light-independent reactions in a few moments, we'll see the role of NADPH. So when we move on into the next steps of the light-dependent reaction, I want you to see that there's a bunch of hydrogen ions inside the thylakoid. Remember, those hydrogens once belonged to water. And so now that there's a high concentration of hydrogen in the thylakoids, they're going to rapidly diffuse from a high concentration to a low. Notice at the bottom of the animation, there's a little tunnel or a tube labeled ATP synthase. This is an enzyme protein complex here. And what happens is when hydrogen diffuses through ATP synthase, you can probably hear the words ATP synthesis in your head. ATP synthase draws together an ADP and a P, a phosphate. And when ADP is bonded with a phosphate, we have a molecule of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, that's been created. Well, this happens a series of times. That ATP actually has a role to play. But as I just said, this happens a series of times. So hydrogen comes through ATP synthase, an ADP and a P are bonded together, ATP is produced. Again, this happens multiple times. Hydrogen flows through the ATP synthase, and a molecule of ATP is created. This hydrogen or this ATP is really important when we go on into the next step called the light independent reactions. Before we go into the light independent reactions, I want to summarize the light dependent reactions. So it's called light dependent because it depends on light. So sunlight and water are going to be used to create some oxygen waste, but more importantly to create molecules of ATP and molecules of NADPH. I want to point out that no glucose has been created yet. ATP has been created and NADPH has been created. Now we're going to see why those were created. Let's move on into the light independent stages. So we can now begin the process called the light independent reactions, also known as the Calvin cycle, named after the scientist who really helped first describe this process. It begins in the stroma of the chloroplast, the liquid fluid filled interior, the stroma, and there's a 5-carbon molecule. You can see it in the animation, a chain of 5 carbons. Now, it's actually a lot more than just carbon. First of all, this 5-carbon molecule is called ribulose biphosphate. I'm just going to call it RuBP from now on. RuBP is actually made up of 5 carbons and 12 hydrogens and 11 oxygens and 2 phosphorus. But for simplicity, I've only shown the 5 carbons chained together. So what happens is carbon dioxide from the air will bond with RuBP. And when the 1 carbon of carbon dioxide bonds with the 5 carbons of RuBP, and the reason they bond is, again, there's various enzymes involved in breaking bonds and reestablishing bonds. And so this 6-carbon molecule is now created. Well, let's move on to the next step. So in the next step of the light independent reactions, we have the 6-carbon molecule that was just created from carbon dioxide and RuBP bonding together. The 6-carbon molecule is going to actually be broken down. Finally, we see the reason why ATP and NADPH were created in the light dependent stage. ATP and NADPH are going to be used to break apart that 6-carbon molecule. That 6-carbon molecule is going to be broken down. So remember, when ATP is broken into ADP, heat is released. So the heat from the breaking of ATP plus the hydrogen of the NADPH plus various enzymes that just aren't pictured in this animation are going to break that 6-carbon molecule into a couple 3-carbon molecules. The 3-carbon molecules are called phosphoglycerates, or you'll just see them abbreviated as PGA. So this process is going to continue several times. Here's 2 more 6-carbon molecules, and the first one is going to be broken down by ATP enzymes and NADPH to create 2 more molecules of PGA. And there's still 1 more in the animation. So here comes some ATP and NADPH, and again, with the help of various enzymes, the 6-carbon molecule will be broken down into 2 PGAs. So the amount of PGAs begins to accumulate in the stroma. So what's going to happen with all of these PGAs, all of these phosphoglycerates? Well, 2 of them are going to bond with one another with the help of various enzymes to make glucose. And that's the whole point of photosynthesis, make glucose. But what about the other PGAs, the other phosphoglycerates? Well, they're going to be broken down and recombined as well with the help of ATP, with the help of various enzymes that I just didn't picture. Those other PGAs are going to be broken down and recombined into 5-carbon molecules of ribulose biphosphate, RuBP. This is why the Calvin cycle is called a cycle. RuBP marks the beginning of the next cycle. Carbon dioxide will be taken in, the carbon dioxide will bond with the RuBP to make a 6-carbon molecule, and now we're just repeating steps previously mentioned. So to summarize the light independent stage of photosynthesis, carbon dioxide from the air, along with the ATP and the NADPH that were made during the light-dependent stage, will be used to create glucose, which is a sugar. Now, why does the plant even need the glucose, need the sugar? Well, the sugar that is created will then be used during cellular respiration. Now, cellular respiration is another topic for another day, but that, I hope, explains the connection between photosynthesis and cellular respiration. For those of you in my biology class, this is going to be your essay question. So very rarely are you going to get essay questions in advance. We'll be talking more about this in class. So instead of the usual practice quiz at the end, how about this instead? I've given you 7 steps of photosynthesis in a random order. Try to put these steps in order. What comes first, what comes second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. If you're in my biology class, try this and bring me your answers, and I'd be happy to check them for accuracy. Good luck.